glad to have you. So glad to have you with us this morning, today. Before we introduce our guest speaker, I just wanted to acknowledge today in this country. I'm actually in the U.S. We're remembering 9/11. It's been 20 years. And the reason why I wanted to mention it is because as we venture into this simulation next week, one of the roles of the UN, one of the primary roles is to maintain peace and security. And I think it just underscores the importance of this journey that you're embarking on. And now, as we listen to Mr. Bill Yodev shortly, who will talk to us about the history of decision-making and the importance of consensus building. I think it just underscores how important it is, not only in this space, but in all of our spaces in our lives. Anyway, with this, Erin, would you like to introduce Bill for us?
Absolutely, it's my pleasure. So thank you all for being here. And it's my pleasure to introduce you to Mr. William Yodev. You're going to meet Mr. Yodev. Well, he'll be obviously observing our simulation, and he is currently the Model UN Coordinator for the World Federation of United Nations Associations, or WFUNA as we know it, where he is responsible for planning their Model UN programs around the world and developing educational materials and curricula for Model UN training purposes. So he's really more than an observer, clearly, but what I mean by that is as you move into the simulation sessions, it is Bill is the person who coordinates all of those efforts and the young people who are the face of those experiences as well. So beyond that, Mr. Yodev also served as the curriculum director for the WFUNA Summer Youth Program in the Republic of Korea that focused on teaching students at the primary, intermediate, and secondary level about the Sustainable Development Goals. Prior to working at WFUNA, Mr. Yodev was project manager of the United Nations Global Teaching and Learning Project within the Outreach Division of the UN Department of Public Information for more than 14 years. He was responsible for creating educational materials for schools around the world on the United Nations and global issues on its agenda. In addition, he organized various global video conferences for students and teachers each year at the UN headquarters on human rights, the legacy of the transatlantic slave trade, and the observance of the International Day of Peace. Prior to working at the UN, Mr. Yodev was Director of Research at Sesame Workshop, which produces educational television programs for children, such as Sesame Street, which I'm sure many of you have heard of. He's also designed and conducted many studies to evaluate the impact that these programs have on the cognitive, social, and emotional development of children in that role. Mr. Yodev is an advisory council member of the Committee on Teaching about the United Nations and also serves on the International Institute on Peace Education Transnational Advisory Group. It is so evident that he brings a tremendous amount of experience and expertise to our topic today. And as a trusted partner and just a wonderful educator in person, it is our pleasure to introduce you to our friend, Mr. Bill Yodev. And let's turn our attention to Bill for our training session today. Bill, thanks so much for being here.
Erin, thank you very much for that kind introduction. Can you hear me okay?
Yes.
Yes.
You can.
can you hear my audio okay?
Yes.
Okay, good. It's a great pleasure for me to be here today. Just a couple of anecdotes regarding today's anniversary. It's hard to believe that it's been 20 years. I remember it as if it was yesterday. And the connection with the UN is I started working at the UN just a few days, well, just a couple of weeks before September 11. And that particular day was the day we were to celebrate the International Day of Peace. And that ceremony was to begin at 9 o'clock in the morning. And as you might know, the airplane struck the World Trade Centers just a few minutes prior to that. And the Secretary General, of course, had to cancel the observance, and also the UN was closed because they feared that the UN also might be one of the targets. So it was a very significant day on many levels, and that was my particular connection in terms of having just started working at the UN when this occurred. It was a really tragic day. So I'm going to be taking you today through a few hundred years of history. We're going to be looking at how the decision-making process in international organizations has changed, starting from the 1600s until today. So it's a long history, a lot of information. But what I hope for you to get out of this is an understanding of how the UN functions today, why it functions the way it does, and how the decision-making process that is followed at the UN, how it grew out of earlier traditions. It's very interesting history. And again, one of the reasons why I begin with this particular webinar before doing a model simulation is our simulation is very different from other Model UN simulations around the world. And if you have done Model UN, if any of you have done Model UN, you will find this very different. And I think it's important for you to understand the reasons why the UN has evolved the way it has evolved, and why our simulation chose to closely follow the way the UN functions today. It is a living history. The UN decision-making process continues to change, and I anticipate that will continue. It's a living organism. The way it functioned in 1945 when it was created just following World War II, and the way it functions today is very different. And there are good reasons for that, and we'll be going over that. So by the end of today, you will have a good grounding in this history, but most importantly, you will come away with an understanding of how the UN makes its decisions and why it makes those decisions that it does. I'm going to be changing my screen. Sometimes there's a problem with you viewing the change of screen. So Aaron and Rada, I'm going to say I'm changing my screen now, but if you don't see a change, let me know so that I could rerun
Okay.
the program. So now I changed the screen. You should see a timeline from unanimity rule to consensus. This is a very brief overview of where it began and where we are today. So this history begins in the 1600s with the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth, where we see the origin of something called the unanimity voting rule. And basically, what it's about is that it allows anyone involved in a decision-making process who disagrees with the decision to voice their opposition. And if there is one decision maker that disagrees, then a decision cannot be taken. That is what's called the unanimity voting rule. And this was first appeared in the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth in the 1600s. If we fast forward to 1864, which is one of the earliest intergovernmental conferences, we see something called the absolute unanimity rule, which was used by governments. Now remember, the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth was a legislative body within a government, whereas the Geneva Conference in 1864 was a conference that included representatives of different governments. And they also adopted the absolute unanimity rule, which stated that if there was any government which disagreed with a decision, that decision could not be taken. And we'll talk a little bit about why. Why would they adopt such a decision-making rule? In 1868, we start to see some slight modifications in the unanimity rule. By 1919, when we see the League of Nations was created by the Treaty of Versailles, they also followed the absolute unanimity rule, but we see some important recommendations to modify the unanimity rule that later appeared after the UN was created. In 1945, when the UN was created, they rejected the unanimity rule and replaced it with something called the majority rule, which we'll talk about. By 1955, just within the first decade of the UN, we find the majority rule starting to be rejected by certain diplomats within the UN, and a movement towards something called consensus, which is making decisions without voting. In 1971, we find that the General Assembly adopted a resolution that recommended or encouraged that member states make their decisions moving forward without taking a vote. And we'll explore about why did they recommend this change in 1971. By 1975, we find that for the first time, a majority of decisions in the General Assembly were made without taking a vote. And that trend has continued through today. Between 1975 and 2021, the General Assembly has maintained that trend to make decisions without taking a vote. And now we find that the entire UN system has embraced this decision-making process, which involves negotiating the text of a document and adopting it without taking a vote. So we're going to explore this entire history. I just wanted you to see at a glance where it begins and where it ends. And then we're going to get into more detail about why were these decision-making rules proposed at different points in history, and why did they evolve and change into something that we have today called the consensus approach. Going to change my screen. Okay, so now we're going to go back to the beginning of the timeline with the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth. It was a parliamentary device that was used, that was in place from the mid-17th century to the late 18th century. It was based on the premise that all Polish noblemen were equal. So the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth, the decision-making body of the Commonwealth, consisted of noblemen that represented different districts within the Commonwealth. And they proceeded on the basis of assuming that every nobleman who was involved in making decisions were equal, and that every measure that came before it was called the Sejm. The Sejm was the legislative body of the Commonwealth. They decided that every measure that came before the Sejm had to be passed unanimously, which meant that if there was one nobleman within the Sejm that disagreed or opposed a decision, that decision could not be taken. And that was referred to as the liberum veto, because essentially any nobleman could veto a decision if he disagreed with what was being proposed. And the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth was really quite unique within European parliamentary system, and it was seen as an important check on royal power because royal power was the dominant governmental system within Europe at that time, and the liberum veto was seen as a check on royalty. Now, in the 19th century, so in the 1800s, we see that there was the emergence of a peace movement throughout Europe. Now, remember that prior to this, there had been many wars that had occurred in Europe. And let's just take a moment to think about that. Prior to the existence of any international organization, like the League of Nations or like the United Nations, how did governments solve their problems before there was any international organization? You can unmute yourself if you want. We're a small group. How did governments who felt that their rights were violated in some way by another government, how did they solve their problems? How did they resolve their conflicts before there was an international organization like the League of Nations or the United Nations?
Going to wars.
Go to wars, exactly. That was the only way they had available to them to solve their problems. And there were many wars for many different reasons. And the victors of a particular war was not necessarily the country that was in the right. It was simply the country that was the most powerful country. So wars were not really a way to solve anything. And it led to many people dying, of course. And normal everyday citizens grew weary of sending their fathers and their sons to war, and a peace movement developed in the 19th century, which aimed to find a different way for countries to solve their problems without having to go to war. Many peace organizations were founded in countries, and people from all walks of life became active members. And civil society, now by civil society, I am referring to ordinary citizens like you and I, began to push for the creation of international organizations that would unite countries. But countries initially resisted this push to create international organizations. Why do you think governments were not warm to the idea of creating international organizations that would solve problems without going to war? Why would a government resist this idea? You would think that they would embrace it. You would think that governments would not want to have to solve problems by waging war. So why do you think they resisted this idea?
Well, may I intervene?
Of course, anybody.
I'm not sure if my idea is correct, but maybe they are threatened by this idea because they are seeing that they will have less power. But
Correct.
I'm not sure.
Yes, no, it's very much related to that. They were afraid that if they agreed to belong to an international organization, that yes, their power would decrease because they feared that the other governments could force decisions upon them that they did not agree with. So yes, that was very much at the root of the problem. Governments did not want to belong to international organizations if that meant that decisions could be taken that could be forced upon them that their government did not agree with. Every government is a sovereign nation. And as a sovereign nation, that gives them the power to make decisions that they think are in the best interest of their citizens without having to have other governments impose decisions on their citizens that they do not agree with. So yes, that was very much. And this is what we call the principle of sovereign equality. And this, I might say, is still an issue today. Even at the United Nations today, governments are very much aware and very cautious of, and also very much, how can I say this? They fear other governments imposing decisions upon them just as much today as they did when intergovernmental organizations were first created. So that problem has not gone away. It's still just as real today. We see it very much playing a role in the Security Council. And I'll give you some examples when we get to that. But it's still a problem. The principle of sovereign equality states that every sovereign nation possesses the same legal rights. And as a result of that, they feel that no other government has the right to impose anything upon them. So the respect for the principle of sovereign equality is what led to this adoption of the unanimity rule, which states that no government can impose its point of view on another country. So the unanimity rule, as I stated earlier, is a rule that allows a government to oppose a decision that's being proposed. And if one government opposes that decision cannot be taken. That was the only way that governments agreed to participate in international organizations, is if those organizations allowed them to veto any decision that they did not agree with. So we see in 1864, which was one of the earliest intergovernmental organizations. It was a conference that took place in Geneva. And the focus of that conference was, now this is it's a big word, so I'll break it down for you, but the conference was called Conference for the Amelioration of the Condition of the Wounded in Armies in the Field. And what they felt was important is they felt it was important for governments to come together to discuss how they can, amelioration means improve. How can they improve the care of wounded soldiers when under the conditions of war? So this was not, interestingly enough, not a conference to focus on how can we end wars. It was to focus on how can we improve the care of wounded soldiers during a war. In any case, it was one of the very first times that governments came together and agreed to be members of this conference. Now, the Swiss government initiated this conference. It took place in Geneva, And they invited the governments of all European countries, because these were the countries at the time that were engaged in many wars. They also invited the United States, Brazil, and Mexico to attend the conference. And at the very first meeting, there was a discussion about how would they make decisions? Would they make decisions by voting? And it was the French delegate that asserted that they cannot make decisions by voting. In other words, the French delegate object, because when you vote and you let the majority decide what is adopted and what is not adopted, they felt that it would be unfair to let a majority of countries impose a decision on minority of countries, however small it may be. So the French government objected to making decisions by voting because they felt that this would violate their sovereign rights if a majority was allowed to make decisions that they could impose on a majority. Now, we will see that by the time the UN was created, they adopted this majority rule, and we'll come to explain why did they adopt it in 1945? Why did governments agree to adopt it in 1945, but they weren't able to agree to it in 1864? It's a very interesting question that I want you to hold in the back of your mind. So they rejected making decisions by voting, and they adopted the unanimity rule, as I said before, which allowed any government to veto a decision to maintain their sovereignty, to not violate their rights as a sovereign nation. Now, the same governments came back 4 years later in Geneva again, and they made some changes in the convention in 1864, which, as I stated, adopted the unanimity rule. They made some slight changes in it. And this is the first crack that we find in the unanimity rule occurred in 1868. What did they do? Well, they agreed to let a majority decide on the subject on the agenda that would be discussed at a meeting, but that the final adoption of a decision would require unanimity. So let's take a look at what they actually did. Prior to 1868, any decision required unanimity. What they said in 1868 is that for decisions that were not really of great importance, they would allow a majority to make those decisions, and decisions that were of great importance, they would still require unanimity. So what do I mean by a decision that was of lesser importance? Well, if we were a group of governments and we were going to have a meeting and we were simply making a decision on what we were going to discuss at that meeting, then they said, that's not so important. Let's allow a majority of countries decide what could be on an agenda and not require every government to agree on what we could discuss. But when it comes time to adopting a decision, let's still maintain the unanimity rule. So that is the first crack that we find in the unanimity rule in 1868. Changing my screen. So in the unanimity rule, in 1907, we have something called the Hague Peace Conference. And again, the Hague Peace Conference was one of the first conferences which focused on how governments can solve their problem without going to war. Excuse me, my cat is in the background wailing, and I apologize for that. Hold on one second. Sorry for that. So this was one of the first conferences that was focused on how governments can solve their problems without going to war. But even still at this conference, we find that the president of the conference really articulated the unanimity rule, and I wanted to just share that with you. He stated that the first principle of any conference is unanimity. Each delegation represents a different state, equally sovereign, and has no right to accept a decision of the majority contrary to the will of its government. So this is a very clear articulation of the unanimity rule. Now, still, we saw that earlier, as early as 1868, that governments did allow minor decisions to be made by a majority, but that major decisions, such as an action that would be taken by the governments as a group, could only be taken if everyone agreed. The League of Nations maintained the status quo. In the Covenant of the League of Nations, we find the following language: decisions of the Assembly or of the Council require the agreement of all of the members of the League, but all procedural decisions may be decided by a majority. So the League of Nations maintained the status quo that was established in 1868. In other words, important decisions required unanimity, but procedural decisions such as deciding what would be discussed at a meeting could be decided by a majority. Changing my screen. Now, problems started to grow with the unanimity rule as international conferences grew in size. So the more governments that became members of these international conferences, the harder it became to adhere to the unanimity rule. Because the more governments you have, the greater there was that one government would disagree with a decision and no decision could be taken. So that was a problem that governments started to become aware of as these international conferences grew in size. It became harder and harder for decisions to be taken because it only took one government to veto any decision. Now, in 1924, this is still in the League of Nations. As I said, there was a growing awareness of how the unanimity rule was making it difficult to take decisions, and they put together a group of experts, a committee of experts, to look at the decision-making process and to make recommendations. And they made two recommendations that I want to talk about that actually influenced the United Nations after the United Nations was created in 1945. So although these recommendations were never adopted formally by the League of Nations, we do find that they did impact the decision-making process at the UN a little more than 2 decades later. The first thing that they recommended was that governments should aim to make their decisions unanimously. In other words, they should aim to have all governments agree with decisions that are taken. But they recommended that if it was not possible for all governments to agree on a decision, that they should let the majority make a decision, that the majority should not be prevented from reaching a decision simply because a smaller number of countries disagreed with that decision. That was a radical recommendation that the League of Nations was not ready to adopt. But it's interesting that when the United Nations was created, they did end up adopting this recommendation. The other recommendation they had was the following. They said that governments should be allowed to adopt decisions, but disagree with parts of a decision. This is also a radical recommendation. So in other words, decisions should not be all or nothing. In other words, if you have a treaty, an international treaty that has, let's say, 20 different clauses, government should be allowed to adopt an international treaty and say that they agree with 18 of the clauses, but they disagree with 2 of them, and that their government will not follow 2 of the clauses of a treaty. So in other words, they started to break it apart. So in other words, they started to say, let's relax the rules and make it easier for governments to take decisions by allowing them to say they agree with most of the decision which is going to be taken, but disagree with parts of it. Very radical recommendation that the League of Nations unfortunately did not adopt, but we find later when the UN was created, this was adopted. So today, when international treaties are adopted, a government can agree to sign a treaty and then later have their legislature ratify that treaty. And at the same time, they can deposit with the Secretary General of the UN something that are called reservations. In other words, they can formally submit a paper to the Secretary General and say, we've agreed to sign on to this international treaty, but we are letting the United Nations know that in this part of the treaty, our government is not ready to agree to what is proposed in this particular part of the treaty. Very, very interesting recommendations in 1920. They were very radical at the time, but later they did come to be adopted. Now, unfortunately, the League of Nations failed in its mission to prevent future world wars. In the 1930s, we find a rise of fascist dictatorships in Germany, Italy, and Japan that were intent on building their empires. And although they were initially members of the League of Nations, they defied the decisions taken by the League. In 1932, we find that Japan conquered Manchuria. The League objected to this aggressive action by Japan, but they could do nothing. And when the League supported China, Japan simply left the League. They said, you're opposing our aggression against China? Okay, we don't need to be a member of the League then. And in the same year, Hitler announced that Germany was going to leave the League. 3 years later, we find when Italy invaded Abyssinia, which is now Ethiopia, the League officially condemned the Italians. But even though the League condemned the Italians, secretly, France and Britain made an agreement with Italy to allow Italy to take over Abyssinia. So even though France and Britain were members of the League of Nations, and even though the League officially condemned that aggression, they made a secret agreement with Italy, agreeing to allow Italy to take control of Abyssinia. So the League of Nations was very weak, and some feel that the decision-making rule, this absolute unanimity rule, played a role in why the League of Nations failed. It was not the only reason, but some feel that it was one of the reasons that contributed to the failure of the League of Nations. So by 1935, after 1935, when Germany started to engage in its aggressive acts in Europe, the League was powerless to stop it. And by 1938, Britain and France were ignoring the League, and it fell apart and ceased to function. It formally ceased to function in 1946 when it transferred all of its assets over to this new entity, which we now know as the United Nations. So let's look a little bit. As early as 1941, we find that the governments that opposed Germany, Japan, and Italy started to take steps to form a new international organization. Even though the war was still going on, they started to take steps as early as 1941 to create a new international organization that would hopefully maintain international peace and security for the future of mankind. We're not going to go into much detail in each of these steps, but there were multiple steps. 1941, we had the Declaration of the St. James Palace. In August of that year, we had the Atlantic Charter. On January 1st of 1942, we had the Declaration of the United Nations. So we see as early as 1942, President Roosevelt coined the term United Nations to refer to 26 countries that pledged to work together to defeat Germany, Italy, and Japan. Now, as a part of that agreement, these 26 countries agreed not to make secret agreements behind the backs of other countries with either Germany, Italy, or Japan. Because we saw that one of the failures of the League of Nations were these secret agreements that were being made behind the scenes that weakened the power of the League of Nations. A part of the Declaration of the United Nations was that they would work together, and they pledged that they would not make any individual agreements with any of the countries that they were opposed to. 1943, we see the Moscow and Tehran Conference. 1944-45, one of the very, very important parts of leading to the creation of the United Nations was the Dumbarton Oaks Conference in the United States and the Yalta Conference in the Soviet Union. And this finally led to the San Francisco Conference in 1945, where the UN Charter was created and adopted. And so the steps leading to the creation of the United Nations started as early as 1941, and those plans did not come to fruition until 1945. In 1943, we see in the Declaration the following statement: that they, meaning the foreign ministers of the United Nations, the 26 countries. Now, the United Nations at that time did not refer to the United Nations that we know today. It referred to the 26 countries that were united in opposing Germany, Italy, and Japan. That they, the foreign ministers, recognized the necessity of establishing at the earliest practicable date a general international organization. Now, it's interesting, they didn't have a name for that international organization at that time. Even though the word United Nations existed, they didn't have a name for the international organization. That only came to be at the San Francisco Conference, when they agreed to take the name that referred to these 26 countries and apply it to the international organization that adopted its name as the United Nations. So they said they recognized the necessity of establishing at the earliest practicable date a general international organization based on the principle of sovereign equality. So sovereign equality is just as important to the creation of the United Nations, which is an international organization, as it was to the 1864 conference that took place in Geneva. So they said that this new international organization must be based on the principle of sovereign equality. It must be based on the principle of sovereign equality of all peace-loving states and open to membership of all states, large and small, for the maintenance of international peace and security. So I show you this quote only to let you know that the principle of sovereign equality is just as important in the United Nations as it was in other earlier intergovernmental organizations. And this will become important in understanding the decision-making process that we know today in the United Nations. Here is the United Nations, taken from the East River. And you see there that there's a little red arrow, and that's pointing to the approximate place where my office used to be when I worked at the United Nations for over 14 years. So every day I would look over the East River, which when you live in New York City, as I do in Manhattan, which is an island, if you live in the interior of Manhattan, it's easy to forget that you're actually on an island. And so from my window in the United Nations, I would see all the activity that happened during the day, all the boats and ships that go back and forth. And even every day there are seaplanes that are landing right by the United Nations. So I would see these airplanes come and land right on the water as I was working. The land that the United Nations is on is considered international territory. It is not considered a part of the United States. It is considered territory that belongs to the world. And as such, no one can enter the United Nations without the permission of the United Nations. So in other words, New York City police force, an ambulance, any government officials from either the US government or from New York City cannot enter the land that the United Nations is on without special permission from the United Nations. So an example, if somebody within the building were to get sick and we had to call it, let's say somebody on my floor got sick and I called for an ambulance to come, I would have to alert UN security that I called an ambulance, because if that ambulance showed up at the gate of the United Nations, they would not let that ambulance in unless they were informed, because they would have no idea, if a terrorist took over that ambulance, or, because the United Nations, unfortunately, is a target of terrorist groups. So no one could enter the international land that it's on without prior permission from the United Nations. So the United Nations has its own post office. If you are in the United Nations and you have a letter that you want to mail, you have to get a special stamp from the United Nations. You cannot have a stamp from a US stamp on your envelope. You cannot mail that from the United Nations. You could go outside to the street and go and mail it in a US postal box, but you can't mail it in with a US stamp within the United Nations. We have our own firefighters, we have our own security forces, we have our own radio and television studios. Everything is very self-contained. Now, the interesting thing also is that in 1945, the land that the United Nations is still on used to be slaughterhouses where they used to kill and slaughter cattle. And so we say that the United Nations transformed land that was used to kill and murder animals into a workshop for peace. So this whole history is really actually quite interesting. So here's the big question. If we said, well, I already told you that when the UN was created, they rejected the unanimity rule in favor of the majority rule. Why did they reject it? Because they saw that the unanimity rule prevented decisions from being taken. And here they were creating a new organization that was created by 51 countries. It's a lot of countries. And they were afraid that if they adopted the unanimity rule, that it would be harder to make decisions because it would only take one of the 51 countries to disagree, and then no decision could be taken. So they adopted they replaced the unanimity rule with the majority rule. In other words, they said, we will allow a majority of countries to make a decision, even if a smaller group of countries disagreed with that decision. So here is something you need to think about. We saw earlier that when the 1864 conference took place, France objected to allowing a majority rule. They rejected making decisions by voting because that would allow a majority of countries to impose decisions on a minority of countries. And they felt that that would violate the principle of sovereign equality. Now, we saw in the Declaration of Moscow that I just read to you, they said that any new international organization must be founded on the principle of sovereign equality. Yet the United Nations rejected the unanimity rule in favor of the majority rule. So how could they maintain sovereign equality while at the same time reject the unanimity rule, which allows a majority to adopt a decision that a minority may disagree with? How did the United Nations resolve that contradiction? I'm opening it up to you. Why would they agree to replace the unanimity rule with the majority rule if we saw earlier that governments objected to the majority rule because it violated the principle of sovereign equality, which we saw in the Moscow Declaration, they said had to be a founding principle of the United Nations? Seems to be a lot of contradiction going on here. How did the United Nations maintain sovereign equality while at the same time allowing the majority rule? Seems impossible, but how did they do it? They did find a way to do it. How did they do it?
Well, maybe the decision taken by the majority could be adopted to include the minority's opinion so as to take everyone's opinion into consideration and everyone could agree up to some point, not 100% agree, but maybe they could be all in favor of doing something similar.
So let's take a look at this for a second. The majority rule simply states that you need a minimum of 51% of the countries to agree to a decision, and that decision could be taken. That means that 49% of the countries could disagree with a decision, and that decision could still be taken. That's what the majority rule states. So it could, all the majority rule requires is that a minimum of 51% of the countries are required to agree. 49% can disagree, and they would still allow that decision to be taken. Don't you think that that's still violates the principle of sovereign equality that the Moscow Declaration said must be the founding principle of the UN? I hear what you're saying, but the majority rule does not require a majority of countries to take into consideration anything that 49% of the other countries may consider important. It does not require it at all. They could ignore what 49% of the countries think is important and still adopt or take a decision according to the majority rule.
Maybe the decision can be taken, but it allows the countries that are against it to imply it to the countries or governments. So the decision is taken like in a general point of view, but the countries that are against it don't have to apply it.
You are really on to the right track here. And you're really, really, really in the right direction. So how the United Nations got around preventing the majority rule from violating the principle of sovereign equality is by stripping most, and I say most, and I'll explain why, most of the UN bodies from enforcing any decision. So in other words, if we stick with the General Assembly, what the majority rule says is that a majority of countries in the General Assembly are allowed to adopt a resolution, but that resolution is only going to be a recommendation. It is not going to be legally binding, and there is no way to enforce that decision. So if countries disagree with that decision, nothing can be done to force them to go along with that decision. So you're absolutely right in what you're saying, but they wrote it into the UN Charter and very specifically stated that decisions made by the majority rule would be nothing more than recommendations. So governments that disagreed with those decisions were free to ignore them. That is how they found a way to maintain sovereign equality and yet allow the General Assembly and other parts of the UN to make decisions that didn't require the unanimity rule. So you're absolutely right in saying it. But it was written into the UN Charter that makes it very clear that decisions taken by most UN bodies are nothing more than recommendations. And I'll tell you, there's one important exception to this. So again, 1945, member states signed the UN Charter. It's one of 6 organs established by the Charter. Do any of you know what other organs were established by the UN Charter? What are some of the other important decision-making bodies in the UN? General Assembly is only one of them.
The International Court.
The International Court of Justice, correct? That's 2. We have 4 more to go. I mentioned,
The International Economic and Social Council.
correct, Economic and Social Council, called ECOSOC. Correct, that's 3. There's 3 more to go. Very,
The
very good.
Security Council.
Security Council, we're going to come back to that in a moment. That's 4.
I
I'll
think that
give-
is called the General Assembly.
I already mentioned the General Assembly. That was the first one.
Okay.
Yeah. I'll give you a hint. One of the organs doesn't function anymore because it completed what it was created to do and no longer functions. So it is one of the organs, but it is no longer functioning. It is called the Trusteeship Council. So the Trusteeship Council, it's hard to say, Trusteeship Council no longer exists, although you can still find it in the UN Charter. And then the sixth one. What's the sixth organ? And I'll give you another hint. I was a staff member of the sixth organ that worked in that tall glass building that I showed you.
The secretary.
The Secretariat, yeah. So I worked in the Secretariat under the Secretary General. He was my boss. And the Secretariat, purpose of the Secretariat is to assist member states in the work that they do. So in the General Assembly, the Secretariat assists in making sure that all the meetings run smoothly. It assists the member states by writing reports so that when they have to deliberate on a particular agenda item, we would write reports on each agenda item, giving the history, or it would be on behalf of the Secretary General, making recommendations to member states on what needs to be done and what has been done, that kind of thing. The Secretary plays a very, very important role. Now, as a part of the Secretariat, I had to take an oath and promise that in carrying out my work, I would be neutral and that I would not in any way be biased towards one country or another, even though my citizenship is I'm a citizen of the United States. In my work within the UN as an international civil servant, I had to take an oath that I would be neutral with whatever government I would be assisting or working. So the General Assembly is the main deliberative body. And what I mean by the main deliberative body is the General Assembly has over 170 agenda items that it discusses every year. There is no other part of the UN system that discusses as many issues as the General Assembly. So it's the main deliberative body because it deals with the most number of issues. Now, there are other bodies. I mean, the World Health Assembly, the World Health Organization has actually one more member than the General. It has 194 members, but it doesn't have as many agenda items because it's only focused on global health issues. Whereas the General Assembly is focused on all the issues that cut across the entire organization. There's another assembly that was created in 2012 called the UN Environment Assembly. That also consists of 193 member states. But again, it only focuses on agenda items dealing with the environment. Whereas the General Assembly focuses on, as I said, over 170 agenda items. It's an enormous amount of work that they engage in every year. So it's the main deliberative body. It's divided into 6 main committees that those 174 agenda items are. They divide up the 174 agenda items and draft and negotiate resolutions on all of them. The UN General Assembly ends up adopting over 300 resolutions that are linked to those over 170 agenda items every year. It's based upon the principle of sovereign equality, as we talked about. Every member state, no matter how big or small, no matter how powerful their military is or how weak their military is, no matter how many people live in that country or how small that country is, they're all given one vote. And as you saw before, they maintain the principle of sovereign equality by allowing the General Assembly to take decisions but not impose those decisions. There's no way of enforcing them, and they are not legally binding. So the rules of procedure adopted by the General Assembly replace unanimity with the majority rule, and resolutions only require a simple majority. And we talked about how the great powers that won the war, how they arrived at maintaining of respecting the principle of sovereign equality, but at the same time allowing decisions to be taken according to majority rule. And here we find in the UN Charter, in Article 10, it says very clearly that the General Assembly may discuss any questions or matters and may make recommendations to the members of the United Nations or to the Security Council on any such questions or matters. So I highlight recommendations to make it clear that the UN Charter is telling member states that their decisions are nothing more than recommendations. So the UN Charter replaced unanimity rule, the majority rule, to make it easier to take action, and it maintained the principle of sovereign equality by limiting the powers of the General Assembly. Human Rights Council is the same thing. Human Rights Council is now a subsidiary organ of the GA, and it also can only make recommendations like the General Assembly. Same thing with ECOSOC. You are simulating one of the commissions of ECOSOC. We will talk more about that tomorrow. And in Article 62 of the UN Charter, it says also that ECOSOC can do nothing more than make recommendations. It has no way of enforcing its decisions, just like the General Assembly, just like the Human Rights Council. It can only make recommendations. The Security Council is one exception to the rule. It's the only organ that the UN Charter authorizes to make its decisions legally binding. And to maintain the principle of sovereign equality, the Charter gave the veto power to the 5 permanent members of the Council that were considered to be the victors of World War II. So no decision can be imposed on the great powers that won World War II. So the decision-making process in the Security Council is really a hybrid. It's what I call a quasi-unanimity rule, because the Security Council consists of 15 members of the United Nations, not 193, only 15. And of those 15, 5 are given the veto power. The other 10 do not have the veto power. So it's a kind of quasi-unanimity rule. So let's talk a little bit about this. The great powers that won the war prevented decisions from being imposed by stripping other parts of the UN system from making their decisions legally binding. The Security Council is the one organ whose main responsibility is to maintain international peace and security. That is their main responsibility. And the countries that won World War II felt that they were the only ones that had the military power to maintain international peace and security in the world. And because the Security Council that is the one organ whose main responsibility is to maintain international peace and security, and they wanted to allow the Security Council to make their decisions legally binding, they didn't want other lesser countries, smaller countries, less powerful countries imposing decisions that would influence the maintenance of international peace and security if they did not agree with that decision. And so they gave themselves the veto power. They do not have the veto power in the General Assembly. They do not have the veto power in the Human Rights Council. They do not have the veto power in ECOSOC. So if China, for instance, disagrees with a decision adopted in the General Assembly or the Human Rights Council or ECOSOC, They cannot veto that decision, but it doesn't really matter because those decisions are not legally binding. Those decisions cannot be imposed on any country. But because the decisions in the Security Council are legally binding, they wanted to protect themselves. And they protected themselves by giving themselves the veto power, which is still very controversial today. The other members of the UN, now remember, the UN started out as only 51 countries, and today it's 193. So it is much bigger today than it was in 1945. The countries that were not the victors of World War II today are calling for reform of the Security Council. They feel the Security Council does not reflect the world today, that the world in 1945 is very different than it was today, and they want the Security Council to change. They want other countries to have the veto power, or they want to take away the veto power from China, Russia, France, the United Kingdom, and the United States. And every year the General Assembly meets and they discuss how to change the Security Council. But because those 5 countries have the veto power, they can oppose any decision that the General Assembly may take to change the Security Council. So we're in a kind of catch-22, if I may call it so. So any change that the General Assembly may want to take or want to make in the Security Council, the Security Council can veto that change and make it impossible for governments to take away their veto power. But there's a lot of discussion, a lot of proposals that are put forward to change the Security Council, to enlarge it, to increase the number of permanent members, to increase the number of non-permanent members. There are many, many different proposals that are being discussed each year with regard to that. But I want to come back to this because it's very important. When we talked about one of the steps, and I'm going back to an earlier slide here, in 1944-45, when we had the Dumbarton Oaks and Yalta conferences, this is where they discussed how the Security Council would be structured. This is where they discussed the veto power. And it's a really fascinating history. So initially, the veto power was really one of the conditions that the Soviet Union felt very strongly about, more so than any other country. Why? They felt they made the greatest sacrifice in winning World War II. They lost more people in World War II than any other country. Millions and millions of people, Soviet citizens and soldiers died to defeat the Axis powers. And one of the reasons why the conference was held in Yalta in the Soviet Union is because in order to get to Yalta, in order to travel there, the leaders of the United States and the United Kingdom had to travel through the countryside of the Soviet Union and see firsthand the destruction that took place on the soil of the Soviet Union. Stalin, who was the leader of the Soviet Union at the time, purposely wanted the conference to take place at Yalta because he wanted Churchill and Roosevelt to witness firsthand the destruction that took place on their soil. He wanted them to understand what the Soviet Union sacrificed in order to win World War II. And so the Soviet Union made it clear that they would not join a new entity, this new entity that they were talking about creating, this new international organization, unless they were given the veto power. And there were some very heated discussions because other countries that were going to be members of this new entity called the United Nations, they did not want any country to have the veto power. And the Soviet Union made it very clear that if the countries that were going to form the United Nations did not agree to give the veto power to the victors of World War II, that they would not agree to creating this new entity. And if you go back in the record and read the notes of these meetings, they were very tense. And eventually the governments understood that if they did not agree to this, to giving the veto power only in the Security Council, that the United Nations would not be created. Does anyone have any questions about this so far before I go on? It's a fascinating history. So I want to make it clear that the principle of sovereign equality was maintained by stripping the powers of the main organs of the United Nations from enforcing their decisions. And the only organ that has that power is the Security Council. And that is why that is the only organ where some members were given the veto power. And that veto power is only reserved for 5 of the members of the United Nations. Any questions about that before I go on? Okay. So, even though the majority rule was adopted in place of the unanimity rule, we start to see in the 1950s diplomats starting to object to the majority rule. So we start to see cracks in the majority rule as early as the 1950s. Which is interesting because we started this history with the unanimity rule, and as early as 1868, we started seeing cracks in the unanimity rule. And then the unanimity rule was completely replaced in 1945 with the majority rule. And it appears that, at least initially, that the great powers that won World War II found a way to maintain respect for the principle of sovereign equality while rejecting the unanimity rule and replacing it with the majority rule. But we see that the majority rule was not well accepted, and the cracks started to form within the first decade of this new rule. And we find in the Economic Commission for Europe, a Swedish diplomat who was the executive director said the following. He said, "No important political or economic problem can be solved in an intergovernmental organization by a majority vote. The taking of a vote is not conducive to successful negotiation." So why did they see voting not an ideal way of making decisions in UN bodies that cannot make their decisions legally binding? Why did they start to object to the majority rule? I mean, you would think that they would be happy with it because there was no way to impose those decisions on governments that disagreed with them. In other words, if a government disagreed with a decision, they could just ignore it. Why would governments start to be unhappy with the majority rule? Because they found a way to respect the principle of sovereign equality. So what's the problem here? I'm posing the question to you. Why was there dissatisfaction with the majority rule?
Because then the measures wouldn't be effective.
Excellent. Excellent, excellent, excellent. Yeah, so if you let governments make decisions where you only require 51% of the countries to agree, and 49% of the countries don't have to agree, but that means that they could ignore the decision, how effective are you being if the intent of the United Nations is to make the world a better place for all? If the intent of the United Nations is to create a world where war becomes less and less likely because the world is becoming a better and better place for everyone to live, how effective are your decisions going to be if you're allowing governments to make decisions and yet you could let governments completely ignore those decisions? You're absolutely right. This is why voting started to become a rule that governments saw is not so effective. It's not the best way of making decisions. Another reason that happened in the early history is political blocks started to form. So you had those governments. So initially, when the United Nations was formed, it was based upon the assumption that the victors, the great victors of the war, would get along with each other, right? They fought together in World War II to defeat Germany, Japan, and Italy, to win peace for the world. And the United Nations was created on the assumption that they would continue to get along with each other. But we found shortly after the United Nations was created, we found that political blocs started to form and the Cold War emerged and developed. Who can tell me what the Cold War was? What was this entity called? We just finished World War II, and then shortly after World War II, we start having something called the Cold War. What was the Cold War?
Is it a
Yeah,
oh,
go ahead, please.
sorry, a non-combat war between Soviet Union and the United States?
Yes. So we find shortly after the United Nations was created that the United States and the Soviet Union found out that they weren't so friendly with each other. And in fact, we start to see in the early history of the United Nations what are called proxy wars. So in other words, the United States and the Soviet Union did not directly fight each other, but they did fight each other in wars that were created in other countries. So whether that was the war in Vietnam or the war in Korea, these were actually proxy wars between the United States and the Soviet Union. They were fighting each other in indirect ways. So we have this thing, and then look what happened in Germany with the division of Germany into East Germany and West Germany. And then we have the Berlin Wall, which separated the two countries. This was all a part of the Cold War. So very quickly, we find that the assumptions that they made completely fell apart. And in the General Assembly, for instance, we had political blocs where countries that were favorable to the United States voted along with the United States, and countries that were favorable to the Soviet Union voted along with the Soviet Union. And there were many decisions that were taken in the General Assembly that were adopted by the bloc that favored the United States, and that in many instances outvoted the bloc that favored the Soviet Union. So there were many reasons why this voting system just was not the best way for making decisions. And we find the Director General of the ILO, very interesting quote, voting tends to become a substitute for negotiation rather than a measure of the amount of agreement reached or a final resort when negotiation fails. So here we see a trend to move away from making decisions by the majority rule, which is a voting system where you let the majority votes decide if something is adopted or not. There was a movement away from that because, as one of the delegates mentioned before, I forget who, it's not a very effective system for having the greatest impact on the world. So let's imagine, for an instance, if I'm sponsoring a resolution and the UN in the General Assembly, and the General Assembly states very clearly that I only need to get 51% of the countries in the General Assembly to agree with my resolution, and then I can go to the chair of my committee and say, we're ready to take action on the resolution that my government is sponsoring. We have the required 51% of the countries, and we're ready to put it to a vote. Now, the whole process leading up to the taking of a vote, the negotiation process, is such that I only have to really talk to 51% of the countries and get their points of view, and maybe make some changes in my resolution if some of them might have some aspects of the resolution that they want to change. But I don't have to talk to 49% of you, because I don't really need to know what you think. I really don't need to know if there are things that you want to see differently in my resolution that would make it more likely that you'll follow the recommendations in my resolution. I really don't need to talk to you. And again, I can get my resolution adopted and move on to another resolution. But if we ask ourselves the question, how effective is that resolution going to be? Well, the answer is it's probably not going to be very effective. If 51% agree and 49% don't agree. And so there was a need to replace the negotiation process with a new system, which we're going to talk about now. And this is a process called consensus. So the unanimity rule and the majority rule were replaced by the consensus approach. And in 1971, we see the General Assembly encouraging all decisions moving forward to be made by consensus. Consensus means that all governments have to agree to adopt a resolution before it can be adopted. And if all governments agree on the text of a resolution, then there's no need to vote on it. So the consensus process replaces the voting process because it requires that negotiation continues and that changes continue to be made in the text of a resolution until every government is comfortable enough with the text to adopt it without putting it to a vote. That is the consensus process. Consensus aims to get member states interested in a particular issue to agree to what actions need to be taken without having to take a vote. The consensus process is a method of reaching agreement on a resolution through consultations and negotiations until there are no strong objections to any part of the text. So let's think about this. The voting process allows you to make decisions quicker and to get through more resolutions quicker. The consensus process takes a much longer time because the negotiation process continues and continues and continues until it reaches a point where all governments agree to the text, or let me say, are comfortable enough with the text to allow it to be adopted without putting it to a vote. And why do they agree to a process that takes longer and more effort on their part? Because, as was pointed out before, the hope is that the consensus process will lead to a resolution that has more impact, that's more effective. So this is why the consensus process has replaced the voting, although the UN Charter still allows decisions to be made by a majority rule. That's still, they have not changed the UN Charter, but the process of negotiation has changed so that greater emphasis is put on negotiating until all governments agree and then adopting that decision. Then there's no need to put it to a vote. Now, when I say in the last bullet point that the negotiation process agrees until there are no strong objections, this is very important because consensus does not mean that negotiations agree until every government agrees with everything that's in the resolution. It means that their negotiations agree until there are no strong objections. So consensus, you can adopt, a government can agree to adopt a resolution even when there may be parts of the resolution that their government is not completely happy with. As long as their government does not object strongly to a particular part of the resolution, they can agree to adopt the resolution without putting it to a vote. So consensus does not mean it's not the same thing as unanimity. It does not mean that every government agrees with absolutely every word and every sentence in the resolution. What it does mean is that there is no government that objects to any part of a resolution so strongly that they cannot agree to it being adopted in its current form. Think back to the recommendations of the League of Nations, where remember they said they recommended allowing governments to take decisions even though they may have disagreements with particular parts of a decision. Well, this is exactly what takes place in the United Nations, where you can agree to adopt a decision, but there may be parts of the decision where your government is not in complete agreement. As long as they don't object to it strongly, they can agree to adopt a decision, even though there are parts of that decision that they're not completely happy with. This is very similar to what we see with international treaties, which are legally binding. So even though a resolution is not legally binding, you want to get the greatest agreement among all member states with the text of the resolution, but consensus does allow for some parts of the resolution, for some governments to disagree with some parts of the resolution and still adopt it without putting it to a vote. Now, what does a government do if there are parts of a resolution that it is not completely happy with, but it's not so unhappy with it that it wants to stop the decision from being taken? What can it do? Does anybody have an idea what governments do when they agree to adopt a resolution by consensus, even though there may be parts of that resolution that they're not 100% happy with? What can they do?
Maybe they communicate their disagreement and propose any alternative that can be adopted instead.
Say that again. Maybe they can do what?
To propose a similar alternative that can be adopted instead.
I'm sorry, I'm not hearing the audio very well. Just say it one more time.
To propose an alternative solution to be adopted instead of the part in which they disagree.
how would they propose an alternate solution? If all the governments are adopting a resolution, formally adopting it, and it becomes an official resolution of the General Assembly, how can they propose an alternate? Where does that alternate solution? That alternate solution would not be a part of the resolution. I mean, you're kind of on the right track, but how would they formally propose an alternate solution if it's not a part of the resolution?
I guess each country could do a reservation explaining the things that they are not happy with,
Yes.
even though they
Yes,
are going
yes.
to agree with it.
Exactly. Now, in the case of the General Assembly, they're not called reservations. Reservation, that term is only used in relationship to international treaties. When an international treaty is signed, a government that disagrees with part of that treaty deposits its reservations with the Secretary General. But in the case of the General Assembly, or in the case of ECOSOC, or in the case of the Human Rights Council, if a government has parts of a document or a decision that's being taken that it does not agree with, it is allowed to make a public statement during the meeting when that document is adopted or that decision is adopted. It is given the floor to make a public statement, which becomes an official record of the meeting, where it lets the United Nations know which part of the decision its government is not in complete agreement with. So that you're exactly correct. And the terminology that we use in the General Assembly or in ECOSOC, we don't say that the government deposits its reservations. The terminology is we give the floor to a government to explain its position. And when a chair of a meeting says, are there any governments that wish to explain their position on this decision that's being taken, that is the moment that a government that still is not completely happy with parts of the document can take the floor and make a public statement that becomes an official part of the record. So in your simulation, this is important, in your simulation of the Commission on the Status of Women, now you don't do resolutions, I'll talk about this tomorrow, but you don't do resolutions, you do something that are called agreed conclusions. It's a document, it's a decision which is adopted by the Commission that's a little different than a resolution, but it's a decision nonetheless. And these are recommendations that you will be adopting with regard to the issue that you will be debating and discussing. And if there are parts of the agreed conclusions that your government is not in complete agreement with, in the final formal meeting where you adopt your agreed conclusions, you will be given an opportunity to take the floor and say that your government, agreed to go along with the consensus of the Commission, but would like to let the Commission know that in paragraph 5, we are not in complete agreement with whatever is in paragraph 5. So it's important for you to know that you can still agree to go along with consensus and still have parts of the agreed conclusions that your government is not in complete agreement with. So that's a really important thing for you to understand and know. As long as your objections, as I said, are not strong objections, governments do regularly agree to adopt decisions by consensus because they know that they will be given an opportunity during the final formal meeting to put on the public record of the United Nations any part of the resolution or agreed conclusions, in your case, that their government is not in complete agreement with. And this is really important for a number of reasons, because you can imagine, you're representing a government, and your government, in most instances, it has been elected by the citizens of your country. So the decisions that your government takes are important, because your government would like to stay in power for however long they can stay in power, right? And that means maintaining the agreement of the citizens in your country. So if there's something that's a part of a decision that your government feels would not be favorable, would not be received favorably by the citizens in your country, you might want to make a public statement saying that your government is not in complete agreement with a particular part of a decision that back home would not be favorable. Any questions about that so far?
Yes, sorry.
Go ahead.
If, for example, a government doesn't agree 100% with a resolution, as you said, they can make a public statement explaining which part of the resolution they don't completely agree. And when implementing those measures, should that country include that part in which that doesn't agree 100%, or it can adopt only the measures that it's totally agrees to implement?
Yeah, good question. So even when resolutions are adopted by consensus, that means all countries agree. Remember, the UN Charter stripped the General Assembly, ECOSOC, Human Rights Council, everything except the Security Council. They cannot enforce any of those decisions. So a government is free to implement any part of the decision that's been adopted by consensus or ignore it. They're completely free to do what they want. There's no legal requirement that they have to follow it, even though they've adopted it by consensus. They're still free to do what they want. The difference here is that because the negotiation process to reach consensus requires all governments to have input into the final text of a resolution, it increases the likelihood that governments will follow those decisions, but it doesn't guarantee it because there's no way to enforce it. Does that answer your question?
Yes, thank you.
Yeah. So consensus is not legally binding, does not make a decision legally binding. What it simply means is that governments have agreed to the decision which is being taken, even though there may be parts of the decision that they're not completely in agreement with. Any other questions anybody has?
Yeah, I have another question. What will happen if, for example, a country has strong objections and it blocks the decision indefinitely? Do they have a measure in those cases for keeping with the process, or a country can block the process itself?
Great question. So, if a government has a strong objection, it can block the consensus process. Absolutely. It can refuse to go along with the consensus. Now, in the case of the General Assembly, if a government has a strong objection to some part of the great question, if a government has a strong objection to a particular part of a resolution, they can request that decision be put to a vote and let a majority decide whether that decision will be adopted or not. And because of the principle of sovereign equality, it only takes one country to request a vote, and the General Assembly is obligated to put it to a vote. Only one country can break the consensus and put it to a vote if they want to. So yes, a government that has a strong objection can absolutely block it. What generally happens, if that happens, there are usually a facilitator is appointed to help resolve the objections so that they're no longer strong enough and all the governments can agree to the consensus. So the first step when that happens is a facilitator comes in, and I'll talk a little bit more about who the facilitator is. A facilitator comes in and tries to negotiate between the countries that object, to try to see if they're willing to make compromises. Sometimes, and I've been involved in some of these private negotiations, sometimes in order to reach consensus, when there is a strong objection, sometimes the only way to reach consensus is for a government to agree to withdraw the text entirely from a resolution, or from agreed conclusions in your case. Sometimes when governments cannot compromise, when there are strong objections, sometimes the only way to reach consensus is for countries to agree to completely remove the text that's objectionable to some of the governments. And when that happens, sometimes during the explanation of position, you find a country take the floor and say, we agreed to go along with consensus, but we're unhappy that some of the text was removed from this resolution that we thought was really important. And we hope that in future decisions that this will be put back in the resolution. So sometimes the explanation of position is used to explain that a government disagrees with something that's still in the resolution, but sometimes it's to make a public statement that they're unhappy that something was taken out of the resolution in order to reach consensus. Now, in the General Assembly, if consensus cannot be reached, even with the help of facilitation, they can eventually put it to a vote. If they reach a point where they see no negotiation is going to resolve these differences, and the only way to take action is to put it to a vote, they put it to a vote. In ECOSOC, they have an even stronger, how can I say, they have a stronger history of consensus than the General Assembly. And if, in your case, in the Commission on the Status of Women, you cannot reach consensus on the text of your agreed conclusions, no voting, the entire agreed conclusions is withdrawn, the entire text is withdrawn, and no vote is taken, and you have nothing to show for all the hard work that you put into it. So there's a lot of pressure in the Commission on the Status of Women to reach consensus, because they know that if they do not reach consensus, the entire text that is being negotiated is withdrawn and nothing is adopted. There are parts of ECOSOC that have never voted in the history of, now there are many different commissions in ECOSOC. There are some commissions where they have never voted in the history of the United Nations. And if agreement is not reached on the text that's being negotiated, a decision is not taken. The General Assembly has a different, the General Assembly allows for decisions to be taken if consensus is not reached. There are some parts of ECOSOC, it's very, very small. There are parts of ECOSOC that have voted on decisions when consensus cannot be reached. but most of the commissions, and the CSW is one of those commissions, only require consensus to be reached, and if consensus is not reached, no decision is taken. So in that instance, a government that has strong objections to some part of the agreed conclusions that are being negotiated can block a decision from being taken on the entire text if they want to, by not going along with the consensus. So that was a great question. And in your simulation, you should know that if you do not reach consensus, the entire text that you are working on will be withdrawn.
Okay, thanks.
Interesting, right? Very, very interesting. In the case of the Human Rights Council, they also allow decisions to be taken when consensus cannot be reached. ECOSOC has probably the strongest history of consensus of any part of the UN. All right, so let's look
Yeah, one thing, so it's more like with this system, it's like they are giving all the countries involved a veto, right?
Wait, say that again?
Yeah, so it's like if one country can block a resolution process, so it's more like all the countries involved have a veto, right? Isn't it? Because it's like,
Yeah, sort of. Yeah.
so isn't it like not progress at all because they don't want veto in their organizations, but instead with this process itself, they are giving indirect veto to all of the countries.
I'm sorry. Was that a question? Can you repeat that? Because I'm not sure.
No, it's more like a comment itself, but I find really interesting the thing that they don't like vetoes, or most of the countries are against vetoes in this organization. But with this resolution making process as consensus, they are actually giving veto rights to most of the countries, to all
Yes.
of them.
Yeah, well, that's only in ECOSOC. And as I said, some parts of ECOSOC do allow votes to be taken, but most of the commissions in ECOSOC do not. Now, I have to say that even with that, it is very rare in ECOSOC for a decision not to be taken. The governments in ECOSOC is a smaller body than the General Assembly. In the General Assembly is 193 countries, ECOSOC is 54. So, and each commission has a slightly different configuration, but the commissions are smaller than let's say the General Assembly. You have a smaller number of countries negotiating. But that being said, it is very rare in ECOSOC when a decision is not adopted. The government representatives consider it a failure when they do not achieve consensus, and they work very hard to try to accommodate, to reach. So when there are strong objections, to find ways to compromise. And as I said, sometimes the way to consensus is to simply remove the text that one or more governments object to strongly. And once it's taken out, then suddenly everyone can agree with what's left over. So they find ways to reach consensus. And as I said, it's very rare when they do not. And when it does happen, they're usually very upset about it because, as you can imagine, they spend hours and hours and hours negotiating, and they put a lot of effort into it. And they work hard. They work really hard at trying to accommodate the strong objections. General Assembly, Human Rights Council, they always have an out if they cannot find a way to resolve the strong objections, they just put it to a vote. So let's take a look. I analyzed all the decisions in the General Assembly between when it was created until today. And this is what I found. If you look at the decisions from 1946 to 1973, 60% of the decisions were made by taking a vote and only 40% were made without taking a vote. Now, remember I told you in 1971, that's when a GA adopted a resolution, which was only a recommendation. They could only recommend that decisions be made by consensus. They could not impose that. But in 1971, they recommended that all decisions be made by consensus moving forward. And we see from 1975 on that actually governments took that seriously, and the majority of decisions from 1975 on were made by consensus. So when I analyzed the decisions made from 1974 to today, I found a very big shift. So whereas in the earlier part of the UN's history, the majority of decisions were made by voting, after 1974, it flip-flopped so that 70% of the decisions across 1974 to 2021 were made without voting, and only 30% were made by taking a vote. In today, this has increased even more, so that today, roughly 75% of the decisions are made without taking a vote, and only 25% are made by taking a vote. The same is true in the Human Rights Council. Roughly 75% of the decisions in the Human Rights Council are made without voting, and only 25%. So it's similar. It's interesting that the Human Rights Council and the General Assembly have kind of reached an equilibrium in terms of how many decisions are made without voting and how many decisions are not able to reach consensus. But as you can see, the delegates really take this decision-making process seriously, and they feel that the consensus process is more effective in getting more governments to adopt decisions that are only recommendations. So this has now been embraced throughout the UN system, and I'm just going to briefly show you names of different parts of the UN system that now make decisions by consensus. This is not comprehensive, but I just wanted to give you a sense of how pervasive this new approach is throughout the UN system. So here are 9 different bodies that use consensus. Here's another group that uses, even the Security Council makes a lot of its decisions based upon consensus. Even though they have the veto power, they take consensus very seriously, and the majority of their decisions are made by consensus as well. Here are some more bodies that reach consensus. One thing that I'll mention, number 17, the UN Disarmament Commission, is a bit controversial because it requires consensus on all its decisions. It is the only body in the United Nations that it has not taken a decision for years because they have not been able to reach consensus on their decisions. Very controversial, a lot of discussion about whether or not they should reform the commission, but because they've decided to require consensus on all of their decisions, they have not been able to take a decision for years. So they've kind of fallen into the same trap that the unanimity rule created. Unfortunate. So as I said, the UN continues to evolve. We'll have to wait and see if the commission will eventually change its decision-making process or not, but it's very interesting. So then we get to the explanation of position, which I said to you before. This is how countries that did not sponsor a resolution, or countries that still have objections, not strong objections, but some more minor objections to parts of the resolution, they can use the explanation of position to make their objections publicly known and put on the public record. Why would a member state agree to adopt a resolution without a vote? when it still has objections to parts of the resolution. As long as the objections are not too strong, the member state is often willing to agree to adopt the resolution because they see the value in sending a message of unity. Now, you saw some reference here to sponsors and non-sponsors. In the case of the CSW, the agreed conclusions are drafted by UN Women, which is the agency which was created by the UN to coordinate all of the UN's efforts to achieve gender equality around the world. So we will be drafting, the secretariat of the simulation will be drafting your initial draft, which is called the zero draft. You will not be drafting it. We will be giving you, prior to the conference, a draft of the agreed conclusions that you will be negotiating. You can, so there are no sponsors and non-sponsors. You will all have opportunities to object and propose to changes in the text. You can change anything you want in the text. You can add words, delete words, add sentences, delete sentences. You can delete entire paragraphs. You can add new you can make any changes you want in the agreed conclusions. There are no restrictions. And the negotiation process that you will engage in will be negotiating the text of the agreed conclusions until all of you agree and there are no strong objections that are left in the text. And that is pretty much the end of my presentation. Again, we've talked a lot about the General Assembly and less about ECOSOC. Tomorrow, I will be focusing all of my training just on ECOSOC, just on the Commission. But again, just to recap some of the differences, in ECOSOC, you will only be adopting your decision if you reach consensus. If you do not reach consensus, the agreed conclusions will be withdrawn. You will not be drafting the agreed conclusions. We will be giving you the initial draft, but there are no restrictions to the changes that you can make. You could make any changes. You could make as many changes as you want. All of the changes that may be, like if you individually representing your government want to make a change to the text, everyone has to agree to that change in order for that change to be made. Or if there are objections to, let's say you particularly have a change you want to make to the text. Let's say you want to change, replace some of the words in a paragraph. You will propose your change, and then we will go paragraph by paragraph and look at all the changes that are proposed. And when we get to your amendment, you will get a chance to explain why you want to make that change. If there are no objections to the change you wish to make, that change will be made immediately a part of the text. If there are any objections to that text, then we will allow the delegates that object to that change to say why they object to that change. And then you have to have a discussion until you reach agreement on whether or not maybe you can agree to some compromises and revise the wording of the amendment in a way that everyone can agree to. Or you may find yourself in a situation that there are strong objections by other delegates to your amendment, and then you have to make a decision whether or not in the consensus you would consider withdrawing your amendment in order to help the commission reach consensus. These are all decisions you will have to make during the negotiation process. Once all of the proposed changes have been discussed and debated, and there are no strong objections to the text, then you will be able to then go to your final formal meeting and adopt it without putting it to a vote. But every objection, every proposed change has to be debated and discussed until all of you reach agreement on what to do. And as I said, If you propose a change and there are no objections, that change will be immediately put into the text. If there are objections, then the countries, the delegates that disagree with your proposed change have to explain why, and there has to be a negotiation process. The negotiation process most often results in an alternate wording that everybody can agree to. Sometimes this happens less often. Sometimes the original proposal of the amendment will agree to withdraw it if there are many strong objections to the amendment. Are there any questions about the process? This is, yes.
Yeah, I have a question. It's a two-block question. The first one, is Afghanistan in the United Nations?
Sorry, can you say that again?
Is Afghanistan in the United Nations right
Yes,
now?
of course.
And what happens if one country don't have the same direction as the people in the country? What does the United Nations can do in this
Well,
situation?
there has to be a process when there is a new government. There has to be a process where that government presents to the United Nations who is going to represent them at the United Nations. And there is something called a credentials committee that is charged with accepting the representatives that are being put forth by a government to represent them. Now, in the case of Afghanistan, we do not yet know what's going to happen. I can give you examples. There have been examples of one very famous example where there was a coup in an African country, and the leaders of the coup that took over sent representatives to represent them at the United Nations. And during the general debate where all the governments around the world send their leaders to speak in the General Assembly, that happens during the month of September, actually. The leader of this new government that took over by a coup in Africa was on the stage, just about to speak, and the president of the General Assembly started to call the leader of this new government to the podium to give his speech. And one of the delegates from another African country raised his placard and said, "Point of order." And the president called on that representative and said, "Yes, what is your point of order?" And that delegate said, "We do not recognize this leader of this African country, and we do not think that he should be given the right to speak to the General Assembly." And the president said, "You know, we have already allowed or accepted the credentials of this leader, and from our perspective of the General Assembly, we think that he should be allowed to speak." The leader, the representative of another African country, raised his placard again and said, "We disagree with this decision, and we would like to put it to a vote." And they put it to a vote, and the majority of the General Assembly voted to not let this leader speak to the General Assembly, and he had to immediately leave the General Assembly hall and was not allowed to speak. The power within the General Assembly rests with the delegates, not with the delegates, with the governments, not with the president of the General Assembly, who himself or herself has been elected by the governments to represent them. The power lies with the delegates. So that being said, we do not know yet what's going to happen with Afghanistan. There is this precedent with, as I just gave you, where there was a coup in Africa, and when they sent representatives to the United Nations, those representatives were not accepted and were not allowed to even speak. I don't know what's going to happen with Afghanistan. We have to see.
Okay, thank you very much. Thank you.
Great, that was a great question. Anybody?
So I have a question similarly to the previous question.
Yes.
If due to some political reasons or due to any important event that a country is newly created, does it mean that that particular country need to bind to the previous legal bonded commitment, or they just need to bind into the newly made comment?
If I understand your question correctly, you were asking about what happens when a new country is formed. Is that correct?
Yes. What happens if a new country is formed? Does it need that particular country to follow the past rule or just follow the new rules?
So when a new country is formed and wants to become a member of the United Nations has to formally accept to make them a member. Now we have the situation, for instance, with the state of Palestine, which wants to become a new member of the United Nations. The Security Council has to accept any new member that wants to become a member of the United Nations. And since their membership has been opposed, even though they have been given a special status within the United Nations, they do not have a full membership status as of yet, because they have not yet been accepted to become a new member of the security. They've not been accepted by the Security Council to become a full member of the United Nations. So any new country, and there still might be new countries that are formed in the future. If that were to happen, they do not automatically become a member of the United Nations. They have to be approved by the Security Council. It's interesting that when I was at the United Nations, they did a major renovation of the General Assembly Hall. And as a part of the renovation, they added more seats. Now, every delegation in the General Assembly Hall, every country gets to bring 6 delegates to represent them in the General Assembly Hall. They added extra seats that are left empty for now to allow for the creation of new countries in the future, so that if new countries are created and formed, those seats are already exist within the General Assembly Hall, even though they're empty right now. At least they will be there and ready. The United Nations does expect at some point that new countries will be formed. Any other questions?
Yeah, I do have a follow-up question regarding the delegates issue. So, as like the delegates are representing the country, like of for example, for me, I'm representing El Salvador, but I may be opposing some position paper that is somewhat like, how do these kind of discussions, so do I have to discuss with in real situation, do I have to discuss with the government about what I'm going to propose, or do I just make a position paper with like the delegates?
Okay, so the position papers are really there as a kind of record of your research, so that you put down in paper and articulate what your country's position is on the agenda item that you're being, that you will be discussing. The position papers are not discussed or presented during the simulation at all. You will be focusing your attention entirely on the text of draft agreed conclusions, which will be focused on actions that you think need to be taken on your agenda item, which deals with the full participation of women in the decision-making process as one part of it. Your entire focus is on the text of the draft agreed conclusions, not on your position paper. Your position paper is there only to help you articulate your country's position. Those position papers will not be discussed during the simulation. Now, there will be something in the early part of the simulation called the general debate, where you will have an opportunity to make a short statement on your country's position regarding the agenda item. But the general debate is not really a debate. It's simply an opportunity for your country to make a statement on what your country's position is. If another country says something during the general debate that you disagree with, or that your government disagrees with, you do not debate that during the general debate. It makes no difference if you disagree with what another government has said during the general debate. What really matters is whether or not you agree or disagree with the text of the agreed conclusions, and if during the negotiation process, if there are other governments which make suggestions of changes that they want to make in the agreed conclusions that your government disagrees with, that is the time where you have to negotiate with those other governments and come to agreement on how the text will be worded.
May I ask a bit more about?
Of course.
So
that's why we're here.
Yeah. So at the point I'm curious about is, am I, as in the real situation, am I as a delegate a spokesperson of the country, or I actually have to do, like, how much, like, representing a country is like a kind of heavy responsibility. So am I going to discuss these kind of like what am I going to say in the conference, or what are my like my stance on issues? So are these going to be discussed like internally within the country before I do anything, or yeah? So that is what I'm curious about. Yeah.
Okay.
Thank you.
Great question. So you are representing a government, which is a very important responsibility. That means you have to put aside your personal positions on an issue. You are not there to articulate or suggest or make proposals about your personal feelings about the issue. You are there to represent your government's position. Now, you have been given links, and you should have taken a look at them, to statements that have been made by your government with regard to this issue, which should give you direction to know what to say and how to represent your government. And you should use that information to guide you in the negotiation process. In the real UN, a government sends a representative to the UN to represent that government in the negotiation process. What usually happens during the negotiation process is the representative is constantly in touch with their government. Like if you're representing El Salvador, you said?
Yep.
So you're as a representative of El Salvador at the real UN, you would be constantly letting your government in El Salvador know what is being said in the negotiation process and asking them for direction on how you should be responding to proposals that are being made in the negotiations. In other words, your government would be giving you direction about where they're willing to make compromises or where they're not willing to make compromises. And so you would be taking the directions from your government and following them in the negotiation process. Now, in a simulation like we're doing now, you don't have a real government that you're going to be communicating with. So you just have to do the best you can based upon your knowledge of what your government's position would be on this particular issue to guide you in the negotiation process. But in the real world, you would be receiving directions on a regular basis. In other words, you would be calling or you would be sending messages to your government saying, this is what happened today in the negotiation process. Here is what other governments are proposing. Here is how I think we should react to those proposals. Do you agree with my recommendations? And the governments would, and the leadership back in El Salvador would be saying, yeah, your recommendations are good, go ahead with them. Or no, we don't think you should make those compromises. And here we don't think you should make any compromises. That kind of thing. That's the way it would work in the real world. But in this, you're just simulating it. You're not, you don't really have a government that you're communicating with. And that's why it's important to do your research ahead of time and to read the statements that you've been given to get a sense of what your government's position is. Does that help?
Yeah, thank you. It answers a lot.
Any other? These are really great questions. Anybody else? Tomorrow, we're going to focus just on ECOSOC and just on the Commission on the Status of Women. And also, I'm going to walk you through the different phases of the negotiation process and what's going to happen over the course of the simulation next week so that you're better prepared.
Great.
That's all I have. If there are any last questions, if not, I turn it back to you.
Great. Let me just take one quick look to see if there are. They are, I agree, Bill, they are all great and thoughtful questions. So I appreciate everyone staying on a little longer than we had planned. Let me, on behalf of everyone, Bill, let me just thank you for not only the wealth of information, but you've brought this all to life because your presentation is enriched by your personal experience about the UN. And that's what we value so much about the partnership with you and Wainun. I know that we all leave with a better understanding of how the UN has moved away from majority vote to consensus building and the value of making decisions by consensus as a more inclusive and effective way to make decisions, especially making it more likely for countries to abide by these decisions. So it's a more labor-intensive process, but in the end, as you said, more effective. So thank you again. Thank you all. Before we leave, we wanted to ask if we could just maybe unshare the screen and that way we can take a group picture. Would that be possible? Excellent. Okay. So Erin, do you want to guide us through? Oh, you're on mute.
Sorry, I don't have a something in the background. I love your background. This, by the way, I have to say this was a great session. I really, really enjoyed it. I enjoyed your questions. They were great. So thank you so much. And Rada, your recap.